New York Times columnist David Brooks writes about his complicated faith in his book, The Second Mountain. Born Jewish, Brooks found himself by accident navigating to the Episcopal Church. It produced, as you can imagine, a complicated faith. A faith beyond abstract concepts and thoughts. It needed to be something incarnational, something lived, something with actual people in an actual community. Brooks reflects on a walk he made from Chartres in France, which became a microcosm of his faith journey. I found out pretty quickly, Brooks writes, that religious people in institutions sometimes build ramps that made it easier to continue my journey, or they build walls, making the journey harder. Brooks goes on to name some of the metaphorical walls Christianity has created, a dualist view between religious life and secular life, which leads the church into a siege mentality where it's seen as the culture is out to get us. The second wall he mentions is an inability to listen, quick to respond to any conversation with a bumper sticker saying, or 1,000 scripture references, which are usually always only a variation of thou shalt not. Real human feelings are ignored. The third wall he calls invasive care. I once worked for a wise old priest who loved to tell me, unasked for advice is just that, unasked for. When the church thinks it has the answer to every person's problem, then it leaves compassion and mercy far behind. The fourth wall is intellectual mediocrity. It's another way of saying what my seminary dean would say. In the church, we just suffer from terminal niceness. It's the idea that we can't say anything difficult and challenging because we might upset one another. We think we're just supposed to be nice all the time. Those are the walls, but Brooks also mentions several ramps. The first ramp is ritual. That includes the lighting of candles, kneeling or bowing, standing up, processing. All of these things liturgical churches like ours do are meant to form us and shape us. We do them not because we want to look and feel pious, but because by doing them again and again, they transform who we are. There's wisdom in the movement. The second ramp is a bold faith, a faith that matters in the way that those who are members of the Junior League or Sierra Club can't quite match. No offense to the Junior League and the Sierra Club. Faith matters. Belonging in a community matters. Life matters. And all of that leads to the third ramp, prayer. Prayer is the willingness to say to God whatever is on our mind, and it involves listening to God and listening to our own inner voice. Prayer is a conversation. It's a relationship. It's the soil in which we grow. The fourth ramp he calls spiritual consciousness. It's the idea that there's some mystery to life. Not everything is cause and effect. There's a dignity to humanity which can't be reduced to the elements of who they are. We are holy people. The fifth ramp is an awareness of categories, good and evil, sin and redemption, degradation and grace. Now, these can be easily reduced to something simplistic, but there's also something powerful in understanding these categories as a part of life. And finally, the last ramp Brooks suggests is the sheer shock of it all. If your faith is something you're never quite entirely able to understand or comfortable with, then you're probably on the right track. A self-satisfied faith, a self-assured faith, is something that we should be wary of because there's so much to the life of faith we can't really understand. Why would Mother Teresa have spent those decades in the slums? Why would Thomas Merton have spent decades in a monastery? Why would Dietrich Bonhoeffer have returned to Germany to resist Hitler, knowing that he would die in that effort? And these people, Brooks reminds us, are just the famous ones. Millions of people through the centuries have given up beach vacations and fancy restaurant dinners just to go work to improve someone else's life. Countless individuals have given great sums of money to build up churches and people in ministry. To meet people whose idea of life isn't to move up a ladder or increase their bank account or acquire more power for themselves is to acknowledge that the word servant means something special. I prayed for wonder instead of happiness, Rabbi Abraham Heschel wrote, and you gave them both to me. Faith is ultimately about seeing wider possibilities. There is wonder and wider possibilities in the story of Zacchaeus and his desire to see Jesus. It's a story with its own walls and ramps. It's a humorous story meant to inspire us and invite us to see for ourselves what Zacchaeus sees, which is what many people of faith see. The real setup comes right at the end of chapter 18, before we even get to Zacchaeus. Jesus is journeying. He's on his way to Jerusalem, and he gets just to outside Jericho. Now, you might remember Jericho as being a key city that the Israelites stumble out of the wilderness to find, hindering their path to the promised land. Joshua takes God's advice, always a good thing, and leads a march around the city, which accomplishes the first Israelite conquest. Israel shatters the walls of Jericho. But that conquest was a long time ago. And now Israel finds itself conquered under Roman occupation. The glories of the past have dimmed, and Israel struggles to see God with them. As Jesus gets close to Jericho, outside the city, he finds a blind man by the road. The crowd tells this man Jesus is coming, and he shouts out, "Jesus, Son of David, show mercy to me." Those around this man tell him to be quiet. Jesus stops and orders the blind man brought to him, and once he's close, Jesus asks the man, "What do you want me to do for you?" He tells Jesus, "Master, I want to see again." To which Jesus responds, "Regain your sight, your faith has saved you." Walls of a different sort come crumbling down outside of Jericho, allowing those with sight to see and experience God still with them. Then we pick up the story today. Jesus enters Jericho, and the crowds are still all around him. Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus. He wants to see too. We're meant to chuckle at the idea of this man, this chief tax collector, wealthy, influential, powerful, and almost certainly hated by his fellow Jews, whom he's abusing financially, climbing a tree just to see Jesus. This man, who is seen as a wall, who almost certainly experienced faith as a wall, a collaborator with the Roman authorities, wants to see Jesus so much he climbs a tree. The sense of wonder comes when Jesus calls to Zacchaeus by his name and tells him he must stay in his house today. Well, Zacchaeus is all too quick to take Jesus up on that offer, as everyone around him is all too quick to grumble. And here's when things get interesting. What Zacchaeus tells Jesus can be read two ways, depending on how you want to read it. Our NRSV translation that you heard makes what Zacchaeus says sound like a future action, but the Greek words are all present tense. Another way to hear what Zacchaeus says is, I am giving half of my possessions to the poor. I make fourfold restitution. Is Zacchaeus saying he's already doing these things, or he's about to do them? Hearing what people like Zacchaeus say is, in some sense, up to you and me and what you want to see. But this statement, this story opens up another avenue of reading about salvation. Is Zacchaeus telling Jesus and the assembled crowds that he is and has been doing these things? Perhaps the problem, the wall, if you will, comes from the people assuming Zacchaeus doesn't do it when he actually does. I wonder if that would change our understanding of Zacchaeus. I wonder if Zacchaeus is trying to tell the crowds and us that he repeatedly gives, not just once, but as a matter of his life. This tax collector is a generous donor after all. He's kind of a servant. This encounter, these two encounters at Jericho, one outside and one inside, are all about something which is seen and given. The restoration of sight to the blind man, a tax collector who gives as he's understood to take, all connect with Jesus on his way to Jerusalem to give himself as the costliest gift of all, one's life given in love. Walls crumble in the face of what we give of our generosity. And when we can live and see as a servant, when we can experience transforming faith, then imagine what we could see. Brooks concludes with a reflection on the idea of promise and commitment in the life of faith. Consider the commitment of God to us, the gifts of God to us. Rarely are the most important things in our lives money or fame or power. When people talk about their blessings, their real riches, it usually is relationships. It's people. It's moments when someone invested in them. God gives us real relationships. God invests in us. God asks us to invest in one another. That is why religion is hope, Brooks says. I am a wandering Jew and a very confused Christian, but how quick is my pace? How open my possibilities, how vast are my hopes. I feel like Zacchaeus could make that same statement. That Zacchaeus is restored as a child of Abraham because he opens himself to the promise of God is the most important thing. Faith, like life, is a journey. It's a journey made easy or hard by the ramps and walls we encounter, which are the ramps and walls which we create for one another. And we're asked to remember, whether today or centuries ago, that with faith, walls can come tumbling down.